Thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates, recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name is Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. Welcome to the fifth of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news, even when I'm not publishing new episodes of the Jurassic Park cast, and I hope it helps you feel more up to date. This is episode 5, Allosauroids, recorded September 8th, 2025. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Shelter Dog from the album Charlemagne, and the outro is Centipede from Snail's self-titled debut album, Snail. Alright, so this episode we're catching up on Allosauroids. To recap who the Allosauroids are and what we're covering in this episode, imagine a pretty big, pretty toothy, big-snouted bipedal menace with 3 curved claws on strong arms. Because allosaurs are the apex predators of the Middle Jurassic with long, narrow skulls, large eyes, 3-fingered hands, and ornamental crests over their eyes or otherwise on their heads. If T-Rex was the king of the dinosaurs, then Allosaurus was the leopard. Sleeker, slighter, but built with many of the same tools to get the job done. Ultimately, the greater family of Allosauroids contains Megaraptors, metriacanthosaurs, and Allosaurids, which contains allosaurs and carcharodontosaurs. And so this episode covers the Allosauroids, the Allosauria, and ultimately we've got news about all those families, the Megaraptors, the Allosaurs, the carcharodontosaurs, and a metriacanthosaur. Or in any case, that's how this episode is going to work. I feel like the phylogenetic tree that shows where different theropod lineages split is still in flux. And I think we're going to discover in the news section that some of it has actually changed from when I started writing this episode. And we'll get to each of those in turn. I like to start at the bottom of the tree and work my way out onto the most diversified branches when we tell these stories. So we'll begin with the earliest and most basal creatures in the news. So the first article is a new metriacanthosaurid theropod dinosaur from the Middle Jurassic of Yunnan province, China, published in PeerJ in April 2025, which names a new Allosauroid. Metriacanthosaurid theropods were large Allosauroids, mainly coming from the middle to late Jurassic strata of western China, in some places like Xinjiang and Yunnan, and we of course know that this one is from Yunnan. Metriacanthosaurids are well known by nearly complete specimens of Sinraptor and Yangchuanosaurus, but the, quote, incompleteness of Middle Jurassic taxa hinders our knowledge of the origin and early evolution of Metriacanthosauridae. A new metriacanthosaurid can help fill in some of those gaps, as they name Yuanmouraptor ginsangiensis, which is known by a cranium and some of the vertebral column, including the complete cervical series and the first dorsal vertebra. It was found in the Yunnan province in the middle of the Jurassic Zhang Formation. The phylogenetic analysis machine recovered Yuanmouraptor as the most, quote, basal branching member within Metriacanthosauridae and provides a new alternative phylogenetic topology of non-Saurosaurian tetanurans. So it's so basal, several features in its phylogeny are shared with other lineages like non-tetanurans and megalosauroids, suggesting, quote, these shared characters were gained independently by the aforementioned taxa. The name Yuanmu refers to Yuanmu County, where the holotype was collected, and raptor, which is Latin for thief, as well as Jinsha, which refers to the Jinsha River, making this the Yuanmouraptor from the Jinsha River. Discovering the most basal member of a family means you can sort of proverbially see how far they've come. The authors say that, quote, many character modifications occurred in the Metriacanthosauridae from the Middle Jurassic to the Late Jurassic. First, as shown in Yuanmouraptor, the basal branching Middle Jurassic members of this clade do not possess a well-developed pneumatic system, as in those Late Jurassic descendants. Second, the ornamentations of the skull have been changed from a slight rugose brow in Yuanmouraptor to a prominent lacrimal horn and heavy rugosity on the postorbital in Sinraptor and Yangchuanosaurus. And third, the alignment of the atlas axis complex, which is kind of like where the head meets the neck, and morphology of cervical vertebrae, which are neck vertebrae, have been changed to improve the mobility of the neck, so the neck would be brought underneath the skull. All right, moving past the Metriacanthosaurids, the next lineage here that's kind of in the Allosauroid tree is Megaraptors. The Megaraptors are a strange group that aren't especially well understood. The first article about Megaraptors is called Evaluating the Paleoecology of the Megaraptora Through Biomechanical Approaches. and it begins by declaring they, quote, represent an enigmatic and unusual lineage of theropod dinosaurs that are characterized by their unique bow plan, including a low, elongated skull and robust forelimbs with enlarged claws. So imagine your tyrannosaurs, and then do the opposite. Instead of dinky forelimbs, these guys had big honking arms, and they had unique forearm bones while brandishing devastating claws, including the first two fingers, which featured massive recurved claws while retaining a smaller third finger. The authors say, quote, such an unusual morphology has led to speculations that these theropods primarily used forelimbs instead of jaws in prey capture or feeding, but biomechanical studies regarding in-depth evaluations of the functions of their claws or jaws have been scarce. What else can be said? They had recurved and proportionally small teeth, they had highly pneumatic skeletons, and were medium to large size, ranging from 15 to 50 feet in length, and yes, 50 feet is huge, and they had slender legs and long metatarsals, which suggested they were good runners. They evolved from small forms in Laurasia during the Permian into huge species in Gondwana by the end of the Late Cretaceous, becoming the apex terrestrial predators of western and southern Gondwana after the Cenomanian-Turonian faunal turnover. Skull materials are incomplete, but juveniles feature a long, slender snout. Though thick-bodied, their bones were heavily pneumatized, like the vertebrae, ribs, and ilium, making them a little bit lighter. So as mentioned earlier, our first article was published in the Spanish Journal of Paleontology in November 2024 called Evaluating the Paleoecology of the Megaraptora Through Biomechanical Approaches. As mentioned earlier, believing that Megaraptorans appropriated their larger forelimbs to subdue prey, these authors investigated the, quote, mandibular force profiles of Australian Megaraptoran Australovenator wintonensis by applying the principle of beam theory and mechanical advantages of first manual unguals of various Megaraptoran taxa with a third-class lever model. Often what can be inferred about an animal, which has only fragmentary remains, is done through phylogenetic bracketing, associating the qualities of better understood and closely related animals to the Megaraptoran species. But their fragmentary nature makes it, quote, difficult to establish their phylogenetic position within Theropoda or in further ecology and behavior, say the authors. They further add that the phylogenetic placement of Megaraptor is uncertain and controversial. Once interpreted as being more closely related to Spinosaurian megalosaurs or carcharodontosaurian Allosauroids, which is why they're in this episode, but most presently, Megaraptors are seen as Coelurosaurians, sister taxa to Tyrannosauroids, or in other words, there's a common Coelurosaurian ancestor which split in one direction becoming more Tyrannosaur-like, and the other more Megaraptor-like, or their arms started doing the entirely opposite things at one point. So given those observations, perhaps Megaraptors don't belong in an episode about Allosauroids at all. But let's not let that stop us from, I guess, covering the news. So here we are breaking the pattern already. So the authors present the evidence nicely. It is definitely still unclear where Megaraptors fit into the Theropodian phylogeny. Now, given that Megaraptorans possess, quote, a robust forelimb with enlarged manus that possesses hypertrophied unguals, and the, quote, unique forelimb anatomy has received a particular attention, and based on enlarged raptorial manual unguals as well as well-developed muscle attachment sites, various authors have suggested that forelimb of Megaraptorans was important to the paleobiology of these theropods and may play a key role in prey capture or feeding. In other words, big hands means they probably used their big hands to catch stuff. But no one has actually studied the, quote, biomechanical modeling of the manual ungual bones, and even more notably, quote, the skulls and jaws of Megaraptorans, which would also have been important for hunting and feeding, have received less attention than their forelimbs, which is my emphasis added there. They admit this is likely due to the paucity of cranial remains, but relatively complete bones comprising the snout of the mandible in Australovenator wintonensis and Megaraptor namunhuaiquii are available, making this research possible. By applying the principle of beam theory, the authors observed, quote, mandibular force profiles reveal that the lower jaw of Australovenator wintonensis behaved as a simple lever, suitable for delivering slashing bites, and likely unable to produce a high bite force. And by applying the third-class lever model, the authors observed biomechanical modeling of the first manual unguals of Megaraptoran suggests a decrease in mechanical advantage in derived taxa, which indicates the claws became more adapted to hook and pull function during the course of evolution in this clade. This led the authors to conclude that their results implied that Megaraptorans like Australovenator, quote, mainly preyed on relatively small-sized animals or relied more on their forelimbs to hunt large prey items through hooking the claws into the victim and pulling them, tearing or slicing the flesh. Continuing with Megaraptorans, the next article is Morphological and Phylogenetic Significance of the First Adult Humerus of the Patagonian Cretaceous Theropod Megaraptor namunhuaiquii, published in Annals of Carnegie Museum in January 2025. As mentioned before, Megaraptor remains are sparse, and this next article says, quote, the humerus is one of the least frequently preserved elements, which is a surprise to me because the popular distinction of Megaraptorans as a dinosaur is that they have big arms. To think that they're known for the thing that paleontologists find very little of is a bit of a surprise. But the paper describes, quote, the first documented adult humerus of a South American Megaraptoran recovered from the Upper Cretaceous Portezuelo Formation in Argentina. The humerus is referred to the titular species Megaraptor, quote, based on its geographic and stratigraphic provenance as well as its morphological similarity to the corresponding element of a juvenile skeleton of the same taxon. The new adult humerus, quote, exhibits osteological distinctions from that of the juvenile that we interpret as reflective of their differing ontogenetic stages. So apparently, quite a few Megaraptors have been discovered in Argentina. The holotype described in 1998, 2 more specimens of which includes a, quote, complete and articulated antebrachium and manus, whereas the other specimen is a mostly articulated juvenile partial skeleton from the Bayal locality. And another largely complete Megaraptor skeleton of a subadult or adult was discovered at Bayal in 2008 and is currently under study by most of the present authors. Additionally, other isolated Megaraptor bones, like bits of the ulna or fingers, and some potential footprints have been discovered in the Late Cretaceous Portezuelo Formation as well. To paraphrase the authors, this paper describes a new adult humerus of Megaraptor, and it enhances knowledge of the anatomy of this remarkable theropod and of Patagonian Megaraptorans in general. As more fossils are identified referred to Megaraptor and described, the more advanced studies on how this family of animals can be understood, and more in-depth analyses similar to our first paper can help illuminate the capabilities of this enigmatic but intriguing big theropod. So that wraps the Megaraptoran news, though it feels like more is around the corner soon. The next Allosauroid animals in the family tree, presently anyhow, are the carcharodontosaurs. Carcharodontosaurs are allosauroids named after having shark-like teeth, hence the name Carcharodon, which is the Linnaean genus name for sharks, meaning jagged tooth, as sharks are known to have, and saurus, meaning lizard, so they're shark lizards, or jagged tooth lizards. Popularly, they're often called the shark-toothed lizards, but that's not quite true to the literal translation of their name. But you get the point. They've got teeth resembling those of a shark. Carcharodontosaurs were the dominant predators on most continents during the early Cretaceous and attained their maximum sizes in the mid-Cretaceous, between the Aptian and the Cenomanian eras. As a family, they grew between 20 and 45 feet in length, with a body plan often consisting of a bulky and long trunk, large jaws, a big head-body ratio, and pretty long arms with 3 fingers at the end of each hand. The Carcharodontosauria family reached its peak diversity shortly before its extinction in the early late Cretaceous. In Africa and South America, the youngest Carcharodontosaurs were from the Albanian to Cenomanian age, about 113 to 93 million years ago, with a late surviving member reported from the Turonian age as recently as 89 million years ago in China. Apparently, these animals are almost unknown from Asia. And it's these Carcharodontosaurs that we're talking about in the next few articles. The first is new evidence for the presence of carcharodontosaurid theropod dinosaurs in the Late Cretaceous of Uzbekistan, published in an advanced online publication in Historical Biology. The authors say they found, quote, a carcharodontosaurid maxilla from Uzbekistan, confirming that they coexisted with tyrannosauroids at the same time in the extreme west of what was then Asia. The partially preserved maxilla from the Codsacul Formation is referred to Allosauroid, though not specifically to the genus Uzbekistanensis, which was described from the Bisecti Formation, which was recently described in 2021, and it was considered the apex predator in its ecosystem. Allosauroid was described on a fragment of left maxilla and 2 referred maxillary fragments, which had previously been identified as dromaeosaurid, but new discoveries made it, quote, possible to reassess the phylogenetic position of Allosauroid and confirm its original assignment to Carcharodontosauridae. Quote, the new maxilla shows the presence of tooth root bulges that extend above the dorsal margin of the maxilla, and the authors say, quote, these bulges are well preserved, and because they are related to Allosauroid, they can be used to further confirm that the original identification of this animal as a Carcharodontosaur and not as a dromaeosaur. This distinction is important because, as said at the top, Carcharodontosaurs are unknown from Asia, but to begin to confirm that they are indeed found in Uzbekistan suggests their presence, even though their fossils don't yet encourage that observation. Confirming a Carcharodontosaur in that particular formation in Uzbekistan plays a role in the next paper on Carcharodontosaurs. First record of Carcharodontosauridae in the Upper Cretaceous Codsacul Formation of Uzbekistan was published in the Journal of Paleontology in November 2024. Part of the carcharodontosaurian story is that their ecological niche was replaced in the late Cretaceous by the tyrannosaur family, though the details of this faunal turnover is poorly understood because only two transitional ecosystems containing both carcharodontosaurids and tyrannosaurids have been recognized. They are the Cenomanian Cedar Mountain Formation in Utah and the Turonian-aged Bisecti Formation in Uzbekistan. Ultimately, up until the early late Cretaceous, carcharodontosaurs were doing great, and then they went extinct, which coincides with the tyrannosaurs assuming the crown as the most dominant theropods and reigned on until the end Cretaceous extinction event. This is provocative for paleontologists because it'd be fascinating to investigate how or why this exchange occurred. But with limited information and only 2 known localities to investigate, it's a tough question to pursue. That's what makes this Uzbekistani discovery so interesting. This paper reports a third ecosystem containing both clades of apex predators, the Cenomanian-aged Chan-Gyu Formation, also in Uzbekistan. Quote, this new occurrence of Carcharodontosauridae is based on a newly identified maxilla that closely resembles the holotype maxilla of Uzbekistanensis, and it is identified as an unspecified species of Allosauroid. So this third locality features a new jaw fragment, and the authors of this paper aren't saying it's specifically Allosauroid uzbekistanensis, but it's definitely a type of Allosauroid. This is like saying it may not be a red squirrel, but it's definitely a squirrel based on the fossil. Except in this parallelism, squirrel means apex theropod of the late Cretaceous. Furthermore, this fossil reveals a bit more information about Allosauroid's jaw than the holotype, in that the X-ray computed tomography revealed some incredible visuals on the functional and erupting teeth inside the jaw and some evidence of the neurovascular system. So not long ago, this species wasn't even conclusively considered a carcharodontosaur, but a new discovery, and now its placement in Carcharodontosauridae are supported, and it's indicating that this rock formation is a third confirmed site that hosts both tyrannosauroids and carcharodontosaurs, making it a special locality that may share insights into what led to the dominance of tyrannosaurs and the extinction of carcharodontosaurs. The final carcharodontosaur news I've got is from an article called Reevaluation of the Bahariya Formation Carcharodontosaurid and its Implications for Allosauroid Phylogeny, published in the journal PLOS ONE in January 2025, and this is a bit of a wild one. You may be familiar with the story of the original Spinosaurus skeleton, which was destroyed during the Second World War. The specimens were recovered out of Egypt, described and mounted in Munich, and subsequently bombed by the Allies in their war against Nazism. All the specimens were lost. All that was left were German paleontologist Ernst Stromer's descriptions and some photographs of the specimens. Among those descriptions were, quote, a partial skeleton of a carcharodontosaurid theropod, described by Stromer in 1931. The fossils were referred to an existing species that was named after some isolated teeth from slightly older rocks in Algeria. And those were named Megalosaurus saharicus. But with the new referred materials, Stromer was able to rename it Carcharodontosaurus saharicus. And then all the specimens were bombed. Then in 1996, quote, a relatively complete carcharodontosaurid cranium was described from similar aged rocks in Morocco and designated to the neotype of the species Carcharodontosaurus saharicus in 2000. However, due to the destruction of the original material, comparisons of the neotype to the Egyptian fossils have so far only been done cursorily. So the authors performed a re-examination of the available information on the Egyptian Carcharodontosaurid, including a, quote, previously undescribed photograph of the exhibited specimen. And they say it reveals differences, quote, from the Moroccan neotype in numerous characters. And they've named the Egyptian species in the photograph a new genus and species, Megaraptor markgraphii. The descriptions of the fossils and a photograph of them, which is ascensioned as UAT 678-20, stand as representatives for the holotype, and those documents describe the fossils. SNSB BSPG 1922X46, now destroyed, which were uncovered from the Bahariya Formation. They were comprised of a left and right maxilla, both nasals, parts of the brain case, and endocast of the brain case, 3 cervical vertebrae, a caudal vertebra, and a chevron, the proximal part of a dorsal rib, a left ischium, right and left pubis, both femora, and a left fibula. The name is derived from an informal name for Egypt, Tamari, which means beloved land, and raptor is of course Latin for thief, and markgraphii honors an Austrian fossil collector from Stromer's team, Richard Markgraf, who discovered lots of the specimens during that old Egyptian expedition. So that makes this Richard Markgraf's Egyptian thief. Finding that this creature was not referable to the Moroccan specimens led the authors to conclude that the theropods of the Bahariya Oasis and the Moroccan Kenkem group are thus not as closely related as previously thought, and the proposed faunal similarities between these two strata need further examination. They conclude, quote, although similar at first glance to Moroccan Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, the Egyptian Carcharodontosaurid is here revealed to be a distinct genus and species of Carcharodontosaur. Megaraptor margraphi increases the currently recognized diversity of carcharodontosaurs in the Cretaceous of northern Africa and further showcases differences in the faunal compositions of the Egyptian Bahariya Formation and the Moroccan Kemkem group. So what larger perspectives does this paper provoke? Quote, these results therefore contrast the often proposed uniformity in the theropod faunal composition across seemingly similar aged strata in the Middle Cretaceous of North Africa. As a consequence, a closer comparison of other theropods claimed to be co-specific between North Africa strata, such as Bahariasaurus, Deltadromeus, and Spinosaurus, is warranted. This topic will be further examined in upcoming papers, one of which is already in preparation. This research highlights the problematic nature of naming new genera on highly incomplete material, an issue that was already recognized by Stromer, who, in a forward-thinking attitude for his time, wrote the following in his 1934 paper. However, I do not condone the abuse of creating new generic or specific names from such isolated or entirely incomplete remains, which unfortunately, due to the unsuitable priority rules of nomenclature for paleontology and as a result of its mindlessly pedantic administration, are obliged to serve as the basis for further designations. So you can see Stromer didn't really like those rules anyhow. Interestingly, when they were running their phylogenetic analyses, quote, in all split and merged runs, Megaraptor is consistently recovered with the Tyrannosauroidea, as was mentioned earlier in the Megaraptoran section, further suggesting that they are not Allosauroids, and they do not belong in this episode. Next time I'll have to include Megaraptoran news and the Tyrannosauroid updates. But enough about Megaraptorans and Tyrannosaurids, we're talking about Allosaurs. You know Allosaurus, he's the greedy giant, the strange lizard, famously reconstructed tearing apart a Camptosaurus at the American Museum of Natural History, a scene which has been illustrated and painted and recreated for decades. Allosaurus was the epitome of theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic period. Big, strong, robust, and well represented in the fossil record. Allosaurs had two crests formed by the nasal and lacrimal bones, which would have been covered in keratin sheaths, and they could open their mouths to a very large angle thanks to cranial kinesis. And they had 3 digits on their hands and feet, and the first digit of the hand formed a semi-opposable thumb. So I've read. Their hands had especially long and curved claws for raking and grasping prey. The first article today is Chimerism in specimens referred to Saurophaganax maximus reveals a new species of Allosaurus, published in the journal Vertebrate Anatomy, Morphology, Paleontology in December 2024. This paper is more than 100 pages long, and it's jammed with comparative analyses to review the credibility of a really big species of Allosaur, Saurophaganax maximus. People love Saurophaganax because its name is super cool, and it's truly huge. With the name meaning the largest and master of the lizard eaters, it was bigger than Allosaurus. It was robust and upwards of 35 feet in length. It was a formidable allosaur of the Morrison Formation in the late Jurassic, which is famous for its giant herbivores, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, and Brachiosaurus, and some of the biggest animals in the world at that time. Saurophaganax was named in 1931 based on a neural arch, and then had a bunch of elements referred to it, including some cranial elements, the atlas vertebra, some cervical vertebrae, some other neural arches, some dorsal centra, femora, tibiae, chevrons, and some metatarsals. However, the authors say, quote, a reevaluation of these specimens shows that some of this material, including the holotype, is more parsimoniously referred to diplodocid sauropods found in the same quarry rather than an allosaurid. What's that mean? It means some of these huge bones in this huge allosaur might be sauropod bones, or specifically a diplodocid, one of those long-necked and long-tailed herbivores famous from the Morrison Formation. That might explain why this allosaur is so huge. Some of the bones are actually from a sauropod. When fossils of different animals get mixed together during interpretation, this is called chimeric, which is in reference to the Greek myth of the chimera, or the chimera, a monstrous hybrid creature depicted as a lion with a goat's head growing out of its back and a serpent for a tail. And not a serpent's tail, but literally a snake with teeth and a tongue attached to the chimera's rear, giving this horrible monster 3 heads and 3 mouths to feed. You can see how this crazy combination of animals is a great name to represent when a bunch of fossils get muddled together and confused as being a single creature. The authors say, quote, because Saurician material referred to Saurophaganax maximus is likely chimeric but diagnostic, we propose taxonomic revision and hypothesize dual validity. The name Saurophaganax maximus should refer to a previously undiagnosed diplodocid instead of a large theropod. And because Saurophaganax is now the name of a diplodocid, the diagnostic Allosauroid materials have to now belong to a newly named animal based on, quote, decisively theropod specimens with subtle autapomorphies that suggest a separate species, which we describe as Allosaurus anax. That's not all. One of the elements, a neural arch, currently cannot be confidently assigned to a theropod or a sauropod. That's not good. That neural arch is problematic. This is specimen OMNH1123, and it is the holotype specimen for Saurophaganax. And that it cannot be conclusively said to be anything means that the name Saurophaganax maximus is the name of something that cannot be conclusively said to be anything, which is called a nomen dubium, or a doubtful name. Quote, chimerism would explain why some elements such as Humerus OMNH 1935 are wholly consistent with those of Allosaurus apart from size, while others, such as the Atlas OMNH 1135, are starkly different from known specimens of Allosaurus. Whether the holotype of Saurophaganax maximus can be more confidently assigned to a sauropod or a theropod will be the subject of future analyses. Our findings highlight the need for increased understanding of serial, ontogenetic, and other individual variation within the axial skeletons of both Morrison Formation sauropods and theropods, given the possibility of convergent or plesiomorphic morphologies that render taxonomic identification difficult, particularly when disarticulated remains are commingled. So because some of those elements in the Saurophaganax specimen are diplodocid and some are allosaurid, but the name Saurophaganax describes an indiscriminate neural arch, it means neither of these animals can be called Saurophaganax. And over the years, all kinds of materials were referred to Saurophaganax when it was believed to be an allosaur. Of those materials, the authors say, quote, with our analysis eliminating many of the previously reported autapomorphies that distinguished the Quarry 1 Allosaurid from Allosaurus, we do not consider a distinct genus warranted. The Quarry 1 Allosaurid was previously described as Allosaurus maximus. However, that analysis also designated OMNH 1123 as the holotype. This makes Allosaurus maximus a junior synonym of Saurophaganax maximus because it had to be conformed to the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature standards. Therefore, the name Allosaurus maximus should be also considered a nomen dubium as well. So you can see there's cascading consequences when dinosaurs get named after poorly preserved specimens, just as Stromer was complaining about earlier. Despite the disagreements over whether the Quarry 1 Allosaurid warrants a distinct genus, previous analyses of the elements that were recognized as pertaining to the Quarry 1 Allosaurid have maintained it as distinct from other species of allosaurs. This distinct allosaurid they've named Allosaurus anax, and they admit, quote, our referrals of allosaur postcranial bones that match neither those of Allosaurus fragilis nor Allosaurus jim-madsoni to Allosaurus anax are necessarily tentative. The future discovery of articulated or associated elements that include the diagnostic postorbital will corroborate our referrals of the associated postcranial elements and likely provide additional apomorphic features of Allosaurus anax. Thus, fully assessing the taxonomic status of Allosaurus anax is difficult without additional material. So there's a lot of things you have to do, and they don't know if any of it's going to be worth it because the materials, it could all be a blank slate when a new discovery comes in. If nothing else, the authors admit they've solved nothing, but they have definitely demonstrated that the bones referred to Saurophaganax have been chimeric, and untying that knot of bones will be a chore for another day. Now, all those allosaurs are from the Morrison Formation in and around Colorado, but there's a European allosaur too, Allosaurus europaeus. It can't possibly be as complicated as the shenanigans going on with the allosaurs in North America, right? Well, our next paper, Allosaurus europaeus, Revisited in Taxonomy of the Genus, published in the journal Diversity in December 2024, the authors did their own review of all kinds of allosaur materials to see what sense they could make of it. The authors say Allosaurus is one of the most famous theropod dinosaurs, but the validity and relationships between the different species have been confusing and often questioned. Portugal is relevant to the understanding of the genus in light of the discovery of Allosaurus europaeus, ML415, from the early Tithonian of Lorena, and Allosaurus MNHNUL/AND.001 from Mandrace. However, the exact classification and validity of these two specimens has always been controversial, both those places in Portugal. Through a detailed cranial description and specimen-based phylogeny, the authors have resolved some of the open questions about allosaurs. First, that there are allosaurs living in Portugal, as well as Colorado, during the late Jurassic, quote, is strong evidence for a North America/Europe late Jurassic dispersal, indicating that it was traversable to go from Colorado to Europe. Similar connectivity has been observed between African nations and North America, with extraordinarily similar species of Brachiosaurus being both in Colorado and Tanzania. Looking more closely at the North American and European allosaurs, these authors say, quote, the origin of the Allosaurus genus appears to be rooted in North America. The dispersal of Allosaurus into Europe, no later than the late Cambrian, was after the phylogenetic split between Gymnadzini and europaeus, and before the split of europaeus ML451 and the Andres specimen. Their specimen-based analysis of Allosaurus confirmed 3 valid species, Fragilis, europaeus, and Gymnadzini, and there were other Allosaurus specimens, but their holotypes, quote, do not have distinct autapomorphies and therefore are considered nomina dubia. That's for Atrox, Amplus, and Lucasi, and I imagine if they had their hands on the Annex arguments when they were writing this, they'd stick that animal in that category too. They've concluded that the europaeus genus is more closely related to the Gymnadzini genus than it is to the Fragilis, which the authors say further confirms the distinction of europaeus as a valid species. They also add that a previously reported allosaur from Japan is probably a Segnosaurus, meaning that the Allosaurus genus is, quote, restricted, if that word even applies in this case, to only the United States, Portugal, and Germany during the late Jurassic. They also identified 9 autapomorphies in Allosaurus europaeus, confirming the validity of the species, and identified the Lorena and Andres specimens both as Allosaurus europaeus. Now, this previous article specifically says that the validity of the europaeus genus has been questioned in papers by Elisabetta Malafaia et al. In 2007, and Malafaia again et al. In 2010, and even though the authors admit the original descriptions of the fossils, quote, it is possible that some features were misinterpreted, they were confident europaeus is still a valid genus. So they're going to hate this next paper by Elisabetta Malafaia et al. In 2025 because she and her latest team are going to argue that the Portuguese specimens, quote, are here interpreted as belonging to Allosaurus fragilis. That's like not what the earlier paper said. In the paper Cranial Osteology of a New Specimen of Allosaurus from the Upper Jurassic of Portugal and a Specimen-Level Phylogenetic Analysis of Allosaurus, published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society of March 2025, the authors propose an embedded diagnosis for Allosaurus fragilis so that it includes Allosaurus europaeus, referring the Portuguese specimens to fragilis. Upon performing a comprehensive analysis of Allosaurus remains from North America, their research, quote, indicates that only 2 valid Allosaurus species were present in the late Jurassic ecosystems of North America, Allosaurus fragilis and Allosaurus gymnadzini. And as mentioned before, they want to refer any europaeus specimens to the fragilis genus, even though the earlier paper found that europaeus was phylogenetically more closely related to gymnadzini than to fragilis. These 2 papers are interpreting the data obviously in very different ways and reaching different conclusions. This paper says referring europaeus specimens to fragilis has, quote, important implications to better understand the evolutionary history of the theropod fauna of the Lusitanian Basin, supporting the existence of close biogeographic relationships between the landmasses on both sides of the Proto-North Atlantic Ocean during the Cambrian Tithonian. This paper says this relationship between Allosaurus found in Europe and North America further support that the Northern Atlantic Ocean was only beginning to open up and separate Europe from North America during this Cambrian Tithonian age in the late Jurassic. They say, quote, a comprehensive analysis of the relationship with correlative members of this taxon known from the abundant fossil record of the Morrison Formation is crucial. Quote, the phylogenetic analysis performed in this work based on an extensive sample of Allosaurus materials housed in different North American institutions supports this hypothesis that there are only 2 valid Allosaurs, Gymnadzini and fragilis. And they conclude that the Andres specimen and the Allosaurus europaeus type specimen and the small maxilla from Guimarota are all interpreted as belonging to Allosaurus fragilis, based on a series of shared autapomorphies in the maxilla, jugal, basio-occipital, and lacrimal horns. Thus, they say, quote, Allosaurus europaeus should be considered as a junior synonym of Allosaurus fragilis. So agree to disagree, those 2, I guess. The next article is Here Be Dragons. Shed teeth potentially indicate the presence of multiple unidentified Allosauroids from the early Cretaceous Cedar Mountain Formation of Utah, published in the Journal of Arizona-Nevada Academy of Science from June 2025. Allosauroids are less common and poorly known by the late Cretaceous, after being very well known in the late Jurassic. Over 10 to 15 million years later, Allosauroids in North America are reduced down to about 2 known species, Acrocanthosaurus, of the Antlers Formation in Oklahoma and the, quote, highly fragmentary Seats from the Cedar Mountain Formation of Utah. The authors say this lack of known Allosauroids is especially apparent in the yellow cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation, based on the rarity of reported bones and the absence of named taxa. However, their presence has previously been inferred by shed teeth from the lower portion of the yellow cat. This article reports on what they are interpreting as likely Allosauroid teeth from the Grayash, Blaine 2, and Dolings Bowl localities of the yellow cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation, where Allosauroid remains are not well known or reported. The analysis of linear and geometric morphometrics supports that these teeth are Allosauroid and specifically carcharodontosaurian, making their teeth the earliest reported evidence of carcharodontosaurs in North America. The authors add that these teeth co-occur with Utahraptor, a giant-sized sickle-toed dromaeosaur, which, quote, confirms that multiple large predators lived in this environment and suggests that North American Allosauroids did not yield the entire predatory niche to other theropods until their extinction in the Cenomanian-Turonian ages. They also can tell that the teeth from different localities appear distinctly different from each other, suggesting, quote, that each may represent a different taxon, though small sample size prohibits a definitive statement on this. The authors conclude, quote, there may be as many as 4 carcharodontosaurid theropod taxa in the Cedar Mountain Formation. Thus, the diversity of Allosauroids in early Cretaceous North America is likely greater than previously recognized. So, we've learned that Allosauroids may not actually relate to Megaraptorans as closely as once interpreted, and that the mandibular force profile of Megaraptorans suggests that they were unable to produce a high bite force, and the lower jaw was suited at least an australovenator for delivering quick, slashing bites on smaller prey. Through a claw leverage analysis, later diverging Megaraptorans with the more robust forelimbs may have adapted for a hook and pull function, perhaps enabling them to hunt down larger-bodied animals through causing fatal injuries by hooking claws into a live prey and pulling them, tearing them, and things like that. And more Megaraptoran remains are being identified, promising more analysis of this as of yet poorly understood family of theropods. Carcharodontosaurs are now confirmed to be in a third locality where they share their ecosystem with tyrannosauroids, including a confirmation of an Asian locality where these animals are relatively unknown. And the carcharodontosaurian diversity in northern Africa has been questioned to be greater than previously believed with the re-examination of Ernst Stromer's destroyed discoveries. Identifying significant differences between Moroccan and Egyptian carcharodontosaurs has demonstrated that there was a greater diversity of these big monsters than previously understood, and it presented a new dinosaur, the Tamaryraptor margrafi. So too in North America, the analysis of more teeth are indicating that up to 4 carcharodontosaurian species might be present in the yellow cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation, though skeletal remains have yet to be found in support. This increased presence of carcharodontosaurs intermingling in ecosystems where other large theropods are known to exist interests paleontologists because it's demonstrating paleoecologies where multiple giant theropods are able to coexist. Allosaurs are represented by lots of fossils, but that doesn't make things simple. The Saurophaganax maximus specimen has been conclusively revealed to be chimeric, with some of the fossils belonging to a diplodocid, some to an allosaur, and the holotype neural arch is simply impossible to say what type of dinosaur it belongs to. The authors proposed a new Allosaurus anax to refer many of the non-fragilis and non-Gemadcini allosaur specimens in North America. And then there's no clarity on the validity of Allosaurus europaeus. Some are saying it's distinctly different from Fragilis and Gemadcini, the 2 best supported valid types of Allosaurs, and others say it's a junior synonym of Fragilis itself. This shows how incredibly similar the ecosystems in Colorado and Portugal were back in the late Jurassic. It doesn't feel like the final words on that subject have been said. And we gained a new metriacanthosaurid, the Yuanmouraptor, from southern China, which is the most basal species of metriacanthosauria yet discovered, which is kind of neat. These basal elements can indicate what it was that separated the earlier species from the competition, and then you can observe through the millennia how evolution took advantage of the niche they were exploiting by the nature of those differences in their physiology. Alright, after all of that, I hope you feel like you are more caught up on what's been published on Allosauroids lately. Thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find the links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Jurassic Park cast, the podcast where guests chat with me, Bill Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also about that too. And if you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. You can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com, and you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Jurassic Park podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you feel you're all caught up on Allosauroids for now. Until next time.